Hello everyone, and welcome to Rome Retold. I am your host Tim, and together we'll be venturing on a journey to explore the history of ancient Rome. In today's episode, we're going to cover part 2 of our survey of the conflict of the orders. However, I want to start out by actually surveying the ancient Greeks, and specifically the Athenians, to talk about how they had already faced many similar problems that Rome was experiencing during the conflict of the orders, and to look at how they managed to handle everything quite effectively. It's a comparison that has been made by many historians already, and it's interesting to see a case study of how things actually can work out, and I think it helps further highlight where the Romans went wrong. After we look at the Athenians, we'll turn back to Rome and see how it all played out for them in the end. The ancient Athenians had actually experienced an almost identical problem of land availability, where wealthy Athenians owned a disproportionate amount of land compared to poorer Athenians in around the 500s BC, which was about 100 years before Rome was experiencing these same issues. Now, there was a lot of stuff going on here in ancient Athens, and to fully cover this period would probably take its own podcast, so I'll just be giving a rough overview here today. Essentially, the Athenians had a similar thing happen over time, where the wealthy were acquiring more and more land, and the average Athenian family was finding it increasingly difficult to survive on what they possessed. Now, this happened gradually over time, where when the head of a household died, they often split their possessions and estates among their kids, much like what happens today. But with land being divided each generation, this meant families began to have less and less farmland over time, giving them less food to eat or even to trade and to sell. However, wealthy landowners with vast estates were less affected by this, as they had made enough money and food to continue acquiring more land throughout their lifetime, and they often used more advanced estate planning. This problem continued to snowball over time, and eventually the Athenians realized they needed some sort of change. Enter a man named Solon. A very long story short, Solon was made the sole archon of Athens to solve this mounting crisis. The position of archon was normally a collection of 9 chief magistrates in Athens, so Solon was placed in a position similar to that of the dictator in ancient Rome to help solve the Athenian crisis. Although Solon came from a noble and wealthy family, he was regarded as a wise and trustworthy man, so he was elected to take charge of the Athenian government to fix the economic problems and the social unrest that was mounting. Solon was granted complete and total authority to do whatever he needed to do to bring about a change that would help everyone. In exchange, Solon agreed to rule for only 1 year, and then to entirely leave the city of Athens in a voluntary exile for the next 10 years, to avoid any concerns of him trying to seize absolute power for himself. Luckily, I can report Solon lived up to his bargain, and he fixed most of the problems in Athens, and he even successfully completed his 10 years abroad before returning back to the city. Roughly 80 years after Solon, more major reforms were instituted in Athens by another prominent nobleman named Cleisthenes. Now, I'm again skipping a lot of details here, but I'll briefly outline some of the reforms these two individuals instituted. For Solon, he made changes to the constitution so that all Athenian citizens could now attend the assembly, whereas before, only a certain amount could, based on their wealth. Additionally, he reformed the law courts so that it too could be comprised of all Athenian citizens. Like ancient Rome, ancient Athens had been stratified based on one's wealth. But during his time as archon, Solon lowered much of the wealth requirements for each class, essentially shifting many people up. Additionally, and probably most importantly to the average Athenian, Solon instituted several economic reforms. First, he placed obligations for a father to ensure that all of their sons learned a trade. This was meant to foster more people to get into the trades as a way to make money, not only for the sake of the overall economy, but to alleviate the need for a family to continually divide their land upon the father's death. Basically, this meant that one child could receive the entire farm, while the other children could go into the trades. Now, I'm sure plenty of families fought over who would be the one to receive the farm, but overall, it seems this did help reduce some of the strain placed on families. Additionally, Solon canceled all debts in Athenian society, but then he outlawed debt bondage, which had also become a problem in Athens. He thus prohibited any Athenian from becoming a slave because of financial debt from that point forward, and he freed anyone who was currently a slave under those circumstances. Solon also instituted a whole slew of other reforms along with these, but these were the main ones. After him, Cleisthenes built upon these changes by reforming the way Athenian politics was organized, essentially making everything more egalitarian and less divisive among the aristocracy and the average citizen. He made it easier for the average Athenian to hold governmental office, and he generally made Athenian politics more inclusive for everyone. Between Solon and Cleisthenes, the looming economic and social problems that had been building were all resolved quite amicably, and things generally smoothed out from there. Now, that's of course not to say that everything was perfect, but speaking overall, the Athenians had successfully resolved their problems. So, what was the main reason the Athenians were able to do all of this? It really boils down to just one thing: compromise. The Athenian aristocracy was overall quite willing to compromise, and they were willing to forego some of their advantages, such as their exclusive political rights and their abundance of land, in order to preserve the overall social and political order. The reasons for this have been long debated, but it really seems that the Athenians, both the rich and the poor, were simply willing to do what it took to get everything resolved in a just and equitable way. Because everyone was willing to compromise, Solon and Cleisthenes were able to bring about the effective reforms that were needed that actually solved almost all of their problems. Along this same thread, Aristotle actually shared what I think is another appropriate anecdote in his landmark work, The Politics, which I'll briefly share here as well. Aristotle shared the story of Theopompus, who was an 8th and 7th century king of Sparta. Theopompus created the office of the Ephors, which was a board of 5 magistrates that held various powers alongside Sparta's 2 kings. So essentially, Theopompus had turned Sparta's monarchy into a constitutional monarchy. The creation of the Ephors lessened the power of the kings in practice, but Aristotle argued that in theory it strengthened the kingship because he made it more secure from unrest and therefore more secure from being overthrown. Aristotle tells us that the king Theopompus reportedly said to his wife, quote, "When she asked if he was not ashamed to be passing the kingdom on to his sons in a lesser state than he had inherited it from his father. 'Certainly not,' he replied. 'The kingdom that I pass on is longer lasting.'" Now what I'm saying here is that many scholars, both ancient and modern, have recognized the importance of compromise in government. The ability to compromise was what allowed success for the Athenians in their own issues, and the inability to compromise was what guaranteed Rome's failure. So, now that we've seen that it is actually possible for it to be done correctly, let's turn back to Rome and see how their inability to compromise festered. We left off with the advent of the 12 tables and the creation of the Valerio-Horatian laws, which gave the plebeians the ability to create their own laws. However, despite all of this, not much else had changed. There was still debt bondage, and no actual land reform had occurred. The Romans had created public land, but this was quickly seized by the aristocracy, and so the problems only continued to mount. The poor were continuing to get poorer, the rich were getting richer, and let's not forget about the wealthy plebeians. They have still yet to gain access to regular political office, which is what they've been going after this whole time, and they can still only stand for the office of plebeian tribune. Now, this was all by 449 BC, which again was only 60 years after the Republic was founded. But now we're going to fast forward 100 years to 367 BC, when another landmark set of laws were finally passed. Now, throughout this time that we've sort of fast forwarded through, the wealthy plebeians had still been agitating to gain political access, and the situation pretty much remained unchanged. Now, the patricians were still uninterested in giving any sort of political access to the wealthy plebs, so the wealthy plebs set to work stirring up the Roman populace once again, inflaming them over the same issues of debt bondage and land reform. Enough of a commotion had finally been made by 367, and the Roman people were becoming increasingly hostile, and so the patricians finally started to fear for the safety of the Republic, and that is to say, for their own safety. However, they still didn't want to give up any of their land or wealth. Unlike the Athenian aristocracy, the Roman aristocracy was completely unwilling to part with any of their money. So, they tried another half measure. In 367 BC, the Romans passed the Licinian Sextian laws, which is again named after the two consuls for that year. This set of laws finally granted the right for all plebeians to hold public office and to participate in the Roman government. Now, speaking historically, it was the view by scholars that this was another groundbreaking, progressive law that finally saw some equality for the Roman people. Now anyone could run for high office in Rome, including even the consulship. But modern historians have rightly brought this view into question, because it's good to ask if this was a reality. In short, when you look beyond the surface of what these laws said, which was basically that any plebeian can now hold office, you find this wasn't really the case. In theory, any plebeian could hold office. That was true, but in reality, it was only the wealthy plebeians that did so. When we look at things like the annual list of who held offices, which the Romans did record and we actually still have today, if we take that list and compare it with how we know the assemblies worked, and when contrasting it with all the different literary evidence we have, the true picture lends the idea that the average Roman citizen had gained no real, tangible possibility of being involved in the Republican government. And a lot of this I've of course already covered in the previous season. So after 367, yes, it's technically true that anyone can now hold office. But how could a poor Roman farmer really expect that to happen? It's much like today even. In most Western democracies, anyone can run for office in theory. But how realistic is it to rise to high public office if you're not already wealthy or at least have the support of wealthy donors and patrons? Of course it can be done, but I think we can all appreciate how significant it is when a humble person of modest means rises high in politics. And I think our appreciation for this highlights how rare it really is. In ancient times, this was even more pronounced. And although we can look at someone like Cicero and admire his self-made origins, we must remember, he only held public office in Rome after becoming a very wealthy man. So I think all of that is important to highlight and to keep in the back of our minds. Because although it seems like the Roman people are finally getting the justice and freedom they deserve on the surface, in reality, the only people benefiting from these measures were the wealthy. And they only obtained this through the threat of overthrowing the government. Essentially, the wealthy plebeians had dragged along the average Roman person as a way to strong-arm the patricians into giving in to their demands. Once the wealthy plebs got this political access, They abandoned the Roman people yet again. No land reform happened in 367, and debt bondage was not outlawed either. It wasn't until 326 BC that debt bondage was finally outlawed with the Lex Potelia, or the Potelian Law. It's important to note the date when this law was passed, which was at the start of the Second Samnite War. It's been argued, and I think quite convincingly, that the Roman aristocracy only outlawed debt bondage at this time as it coincided with the beginning of Rome's wider territorial expansion. As we talked about earlier this season, by the end of the 300s BC, Rome was finally fighting larger wars and expanding territory rapidly, having conquered the Latins, Etruscans, Samnites, and then the Greeks. All of this afforded Rome one thing in great abundance: slave labor through prisoners of war. Now that Rome had a huge influx of slaves being acquired thanks to the people that were captured in battle, the Roman aristocracy no longer needed so many Roman citizens to be working their farmland through debt bondage. Instead, they were now using enslaved prisoners of war. Freed from this requirement, the aristocracy tossed the Roman citizen a bone and finally outlawed the practice of debt bondage. I think this highlights yet again how the Roman aristocracy was completely unwilling to compromise, and that they would only make concessions if there was some sort of profit in it for them. The next, and typically seen as the final major event of the conflict of orders, happened in 287 BC with the passage of the Lex Hortensia, or the Hortensian Law. Although the plebeians had been given the right to pass their own laws back in 449 BC, these laws had to first be ratified by the Senate before they came into effect. The Lex Hortensia undid all of that and allowed for any law passed by the plebeians to be unilaterally binding immediately, without any sort of ratification or approval by any other body within the Roman government. So, with the passage of this law, the plebeian assembly had really now become the most powerful element in the Roman government. They can pass their own unilateral laws that cannot be blocked or vetoed in any sort of way, and yet the plebeians themselves still have the power to veto laws through the plebeian tribunes that the patricians might try and pass. So by 287, the tables have completely flipped, and the power of the patricians is largely nominal. Now, this was all largely seen as a positive improvement for the average Roman people among historians throughout the ages, but modern historians have highlighted how this imbalance really spelled the end of the Republic. Because again, the average Roman person wasn't the one that had any level of participation in the government, and that it all really just came down to the wealthy plebeians who were another small group vying for all of this power. With the final passage of this law, they had finally solidified this power amongst themselves, and basically they had blocked out the patricians. It still took a while for everything to come undone, but as we'll see when we get to the late Republic, it comes undone in a big way. I feel I should also mention once more, land reform was still not addressed with any of this legislation, and it's why it was still something that the Gracchi brothers were trying to deal with 100 years later. And that's basically it for the conflict of the orders. It all started out with the average Roman citizen wanting their fair share of land so they could make enough food and money to survive. This was really the root cause of everything. Even though debt bondage was also an issue, that was really only part of the problem, because the reason the Romans couldn't keep themselves out of debt was because of a lack of land. The patricians were happy to ignore all of these problems, and only when the wealthy plebs riled up the poor did the patricians make any sort of concession. However, instead of actually fixing this root cause, they only gave the wealthy plebs what they wanted, which was political power. Therefore, the conflict of the orders was really just a battle between two wealthy groups of people, and the average Roman citizen was trampled underfoot. Although many people have lamented the fall of the Republic throughout history, Perhaps we can now understand why the Roman people were so happy to see this government fail, and to instead place their trust in a strong emperor who could actually deliver them some form of relief. That really brings us to the end of our timeline for the early Republic. Next season, we'll kick things off with the Middle Republic, which will mostly have us looking at the 3 Punic Wars. Before we jump onto that, the rest of Season 2 will have a few more special topic episodes, and we'll look at some things in depth. Now, the next episode will be looking at Roman colonization, where we'll see how Rome did not just expand her territory militarily, but also through a concerted, methodical policy of establishing colonies throughout the Italian peninsula. The conflict of the orders, a struggle that had shaken the foundations of the Roman Republic, finally came to an end. But the consequences of the conflict would be felt for generations to come. The patricians and plebeians had found a way to coexist for now, but the underlying tensions that had driven them apart remained, and all of this sat like a powder keg, waiting to be ignited. The Republic, like a house built on shifting sands, was unstable and fragile, its institutions and traditions strained to the breaking point. And as the Republic struggled to find its footing, the rivalries and ambitions of the wealthy simmered. The rise of strongmen like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, men who would exploit the Republic's weaknesses and shatter its fragile peace. These issues were all looming on the horizon, like a dark and foreboding shadow that would soon engulf the city. Thank you for listening. Feel free to check out our website at Retold.com, where you can find out more about the podcast and find links to other platforms for listening. You can even support us through Patreon, where you can help support the time, money, and research that goes into providing this podcast. You can also find the link to our Discord server, where you can join our community, ask any questions, or offer suggestions for future podcast topics. Or you can just join in on any of our discussions about ancient Rome. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.